All right, this week the college football playoff rankings came out for the first time in the season. There will be about 4 or 5 more of these before it actually truly matters. But the great thing about this initial one is we get to see what the committee who gets to pick the college football playoff actually thinks, what they actually feel for these teams, and it usually is a little bit of a difference from what we see in the AP and the coaches poll. So it's always nice to see what they're truly thinking, and then you start to see the voters then change theirs. So in this first college football playoff, what I'm going to do, I'm going to list off the top. I'll do the top 10, and then I'll compare it to the AP. Number one ranked team, according to the College Football Playoff Committee, was Ohio State. They're number 3 in the AP rankings. Number 2 was LSU Tigers. They were number 1 in the AP. Number 3 was Alabama. They're number 2 in the AP. Number 4 is Penn State. They're 5th in the AP rankings. Clemson, number 5. They're 4th in the AP rankings. 6 is Georgia. They're also 6. 7, Oregon is also 7. 8, Utah. 9, Oklahoma, and 10, Florida. Those are all the same in the AP. So I think a lot of that the top 5 was the biggest mix-up. Now, my thoughts on this, I'm a little surprised Ohio State is number 1 over LSU. It's not that big of a deal, but it surprised me just a little bit. LSU's had some more marquee wins on the season. You know, they beat Texas at Texas. They beat Florida. They beat Auburn. Those are, Auburn was a top 10 team when they played them. Florida was a top 10 team when they played them. Texas was a top 10 team when they played them. So in essence, they beat 3 top 10 teams. If we look, Florida's 10 right now. Auburn is 11, and Texas is not even ranked in the college football playoff. So maybe that Texas win, doesn't have as much significance at this point right now than it did at one point. Whereas was Ohio State, they beat Cincinnati, which is 20th, and they beat Wisconsin, which is 13th. But they've been just housing teams. They're scoring 38-7 over Wisconsin, 52-3 over Northwestern, 34-10 over Michigan State, 48-7 against Nebraska. They beat that Cincinnati team 42-0. I think their margin of victory, they're passing the eye test. The committee probably is looking at Ohio State and LSU, they probably said, you know what, LSU might have some bigger wins, but Ohio State has just crushed. If I was making this, I probably would have had LSU number 1. They've looked to me like the best team, but I think it's splitting hairs at this point, especially this early. The biggest surprise, I think, is Clemson being 5th. It's not that big of a surprise when you actually think about it, but it's also pretty telling too. Right now, Clemson is undefeated, 9-0. So is Penn State and Alabama. But you're seeing Clemson get pushed down a little bit, just like they dropped a few weeks ago in the AP polls, because they haven't played anybody good, and they had that narrow win over North Carolina where they had to survive a 2-point conversion attempt to get that win. Now, the thing that I have an issue here, I have no problem with Penn State being ranked over Clemson at this point. Both teams are undefeated. Penn State has looked very talented, and they've done it against a tougher schedule than Clemson. Okay, so I have no problem with Penn State being 4. What I have a little bit of an issue is, why is Penn State not ahead of Alabama? If you're going to punish Clemson to an extent for not having that toughest of schedule and not having any marquee wins, do we truly know how good they are? You can say the same thing from Alabama. Alabama's toughest competition so far this year is Texas A&M. They beat them 47-28. Clemson played that same A&M team, beat them 24-10. Okay, so they had a common opponent, and they beat them by Clemson actually beat them by a bigger margin. Okay, I get that Clemson is probably a little bit lower because that North Carolina almost lost, and I'm fine with them being 5. But if you're going to have that same, pushing one team down, why isn't Alabama pushed down too? Right? Clemson, you punished for not playing a good enough schedule so far this year. Alabama, hasn't had that same thing. And I think what's going to hurt Alabama is, here's all that matters though. Alabama plays LSU this week. If they beat LSU and beat Auburn, they're in no matter what. But I just was a little surprised that if, they applied one logic to one team in Clemson, but they didn't apply the same logic to, you give Clemson's the defending national championship, and maybe Alabama has just looked better overall. But I think Penn State's done enough that they warranted being rated over both of those teams. Now, I mentioned that Clemson's position is telling, and that's because they're fifth right now. And they're playing in a weak ACC, an ACC that's, doesn't really have another team out there. Who do you think is the second best team in the ACC? Is it Virginia? Is it, who is it? And why I think that's telling is in the past, Clemson's been able to lose a game and still get into the playoffs. But with their conference being this bad this year, and there's not really another team out there that they can beat, because if you look at their remaining schedule, they've got NC State coming up, Wake Forest coming up, and South Carolina. Wake is probably that second team in the ACC that they're going to, the second best team. So they're going to get that, and Wake Forest is rated 19th in this poll. But if Clemson loses a game, I think they're going to lose out to one of these other teams. If we have, multiple one-loss teams, we only have a couple undefeated teams, I could see Clemson not getting into the playoffs because of the relative weakness of their schedule. So that's telling that they've got them at 5. It'll all play out. I don't think Clemson's going to lose a game as good as Wake Forest is. Clemson seems to be on a totally different level. Now, at number 6 is Georgia, 7 Oregon, and 8 Utah. This will be kind of interesting to play out, and I'm really anxious to see how these Pac-12 teams are going to do. A lot of people thought that the Pac-12 was out of the playoffs after Oregon lost at the beginning of the season to Auburn, but they've rebounded nicely. And I think Auburn's still kind of being competitive. Now, who knows? Auburn still has Alabama to play yet this season. So that's probably going to be a third loss, we think. But they also have Georgia, too. So they could technically be a 4-loss team, and that's definitely going to hurt Alabama's chances, or Oregon's chances, because their supposed marquee loss is looking worse and worse, as the season goes on, even though they're still a very talented team. But it'll be curious to see, because if both Utah and Oregon continue to win, they'll match up against each other in the Pac-12 championship game. And, if you're looking at the way this goes, LSU or Alabama, one of them is going to get a loss this year. Penn State, Ohio State, one of them is going to get a loss. If Oregon or Utah, especially Oregon, can run the table and win the entire Pac-12, be undefeated, that one-loss team, how is that going to be compared to a Penn State who didn't win their conference championship game? How is that going to get compared to the other SEC school, whether it's LSU or Alabama? Can Oregon get enough momentum going to get there? But if you look at their schedule, their marquee wins, is Washington going to be a top 25 team by the end of the season? Maybe. Is USC? Probably not. They don't really have that. So that is, I think that Utah game will be huge. Now, like I said, we still got plenty of season to go.